Hi everyone, it's the second weekend of April, and this is the weekly. So, in the first broadcast, we talked about how human systems are wired to function and how that relates to where we are in different simultaneously operating natural cycles. In last week's broadcast, we talked about how the increasingly improper allocation of duties and responsibilities is likely to reduce our ability to maintain today's world population, which is where the current trajectory of centralization leads, even without having to resort to explanations that involve the conspiring of powerful groups, true or false. This week, I want to talk about the idea of emergence, because centralization is not a simple phenomenon. Layers of systems embedded within each other can form into patterns that involve different degrees of centralization at different levels. Instead of trying to make that make more sense right now, I'm just going to start with my explanation, and then maybe I can come back um, to this idea at the end, by which point it'll hopefully make more sense. So, what is emergence? Emergence is a property that emerges out of the aggregate interactions of a group of whatever it is you're talking about. I previously referred to emergent properties of humans, such as free market, religion, nationalism. These are kind of forces that are bigger than the individual that arise naturally when multiple individuals are interacting with each other. Now, the idea behind emergence is that a whole can have different properties than the sum of its parts. So you can think about cells and molecules making up a human. Um, there's lots of properties that exist in yourself as a human being that your cells and molecules don't have. So your consciousness, for example, it would be, well, you can think of it as an emergent property of the matter that makes you up, or you can take a more spiritual view, or a combination of both. And another example is if you think of water. Water is wet, right? But you need some water for it to be wet. You can't have a single water molecule that is liquid or wet, because liquidity and wetness is an emergent property resulting from the interactions of multiple water molecules acting together. And there's a lot of emergent properties that you can see in ant colonies, and there is a lot of research that compares the emergent structures of ant colonies to the way that the human brain is structured. So the colony, in a way, acts like one big brain. But I'll get to that a little bit more right now. So ants, basically, a single ant doesn't have any planning ability, doesn't really have the mental capacity to build a complex structure. But when all of these different ants are interacting together in accordance with certain rules, the execution of those rules creates these emergent properties, like these complex structures, these job divisions, and all of that kind of stuff. So obviously, there's a bunch of different kinds of ants, and they are all evolved to, be a little different adaptations, different abilities. But your standard North American ant, they'll leave pheromones with information that other ants react to. So let's just simplify things and see there's uh, inside worker ants and outside worker ants. Then the inside worker ants will keep emitting this pheromone that marks the fact that they are an inside worker ant, and the same with the outside worker ants. And what happens is, as the ants move around, they're constantly detecting the balance of pheromones between the different jobs. And if there's an imbalance, for example, let's say some kid walks along and sees the ant colony and kills all the outside workers, then what happens is eventually the inside workers detect that the balance of pheromones is off, and it'll automatically trigger some of the inside workers to become outside workers. So it's interesting because it's kind of like um, you can compare it to like synaptic patterns, like uh, different signals that your brain makes, and how different signals in your brain are related to other signals that um, basically you have neural pathways that are connected in a certain pattern and are reinforced. Or you can think of it kind of like the free market, where um, if there was only two jobs, for example, construction workers and cashiers, um, if you know all construction workers disappeared one day, then you could think about maybe the invisible hand of the free market would shift supply and demand to the point where the cashiers will become construction workers. Um, very simplified example, but um, another example other than ants might be an imperfect dice. So let's say you have a loaded dice, but it's not, completely rigged. So maybe your chances of rolling a six are just slightly bigger than the other numbers. Then when you first start rolling it, it might seem random, but with enough iterations, a clear pattern emerges. So if you roll the dice maybe like 10 times, then you're not really going to notice um, that the it's loaded towards six. Well, I'm talking about this dice that I'm talking about. It's lightly loaded enough that if you rolled it six times, you rolled it 10 times, say, maybe you actually get like three sixes, and then you get one of each of the other numbers, and then you get another. Um, how many rolls am I up to? You have two rolls left, so you get like a two and a three. So you get like a one, two, two, three, three, four, five, six, six, six. Then you don't really have enough data to really say whether or not this dice is loaded and by how much, because you have a small sample size, right? But if you roll the dice, let's say 1,000,000 times, then you're going to get really close to the exact proportion of rolls statistically that would land as a six. So this observation of exactly how loaded this dice is has to be an emergent property of multiple observations. Maybe that, I don't know how good of how confusing of an example that is. I'll go back to ants. Um, so like in an ant colony or in the free market, ideally, there's no mastermind giving commands. It's just single units communicating with their neighbors and acting according to the feedback they get in this kind of decentralized network. Kind of like how your brain works in a way. And if uh, you know if your mind is an emergent property of the matter that makes you up, and nations are an emergent property of culture and history that form its people, then it's not just some social construct to be fucked around with. It's actually probably a biological adaptation necessary for our survival. It's not something to be destroyed so flippantly so that it can be replaced by the hubris of central planning. Nations themselves are an emergent property that are born, they're traumatized, they die. They exist independent of people being born and people dying, people immigrating or people emigrating. Whether we live or die, the nation can survive, but only if enough of us live and die for the nation. Just like how God told Abraham that he would spare Sodom and Gomorrah for the sake of just 10 righteous people. If everyone abandons the task of upkeeping a nation, then the nation is doomed and it has to die. How dare man think that he can kill the nations created by God and micromanage the ant colony from the central headquarters? What kind of unspeakable hubris is that, really? In an ant colony, or in ourselves, or in a free market, there's no mastermind giving commands, just single units communicating with their neighbors and acting according to the feedback they get. And throughout history and throughout the natural world, you can see so many examples of decentralized networks working in harmony where central planning would absolutely screw it up, because a decentralized network can pay attention to more input factors than any central planner could. The central planner of any complex network simply can't um, predict all of the unforeseen knock-on effects of their actions, and they can't really micromanage the fact that there are just so many interactions between different actors that um, anything that you do can have a real butterfly effect. And I go back to one of my favorite Peterson quotes, which is that um, it's really hard to make a complicated system better, but it's really easy to make it worse. So, also on the topic of emergence, I kind of wanted to talk about this idea, which is really trippy, but I think that people should really understand this kind of thing in order to have the prerequisite humility to really think about, just how unaware of our own incompetence we are as humans. So, your mind is actually emergent out of two subminds, and that kind of sounds crazy at first, but let me explain. So your brain is actually divided into two hemispheres, and each hemisphere kind of does half of the work of being you. You might remember from grade school that your left hemisphere controls the right side of your body, and your right hemisphere controls the left side of your body. And normally, this is not an issue because your hemispheres are connected, so they're well integrated throughout the development of your brain in the first 20 something years of your life. So it gives you this coherent sense of having a singular self. And the corpus callosum is what we call the connection between these two hemispheres. But this connection can become dysfunctional through stroke or infection, through tumor, through an arterial rupture, multiple sclerosis. There's even a rare alcohol-related condition called the Markia-Fava-Bignami disease, which can also affect your corpus callosum. It can also just fail to develop, or it can be removed. It was once used as an epilepsy treatment to basically divide the two halves of your brain. And problems with the corpus callosum causes what's called split brain syndrome. Now, this is some trippy shit. So, we can take observations of people who had this issue to learn about how we ourselves work. So, in split brain patients, left hand and right hand, they'll actually disagree on decision making, as if half of your body was actually possessed by a separate, different person. And both brains receive one half of the body's sensory input and controls one half of the motor function. And this is for normal brains and split brains. You your right eye input goes to your left brain and vice versa. But your verbal capability, your verbal capacity, and your verbal faculties are usually developed in your left side brain. So basically, now you have these in split brain patients, you have these almost like two separate consciousnesses, but only one of them has the ability to use words and speak. And the other side of your brain is responsible for usually being able to do facial recognition. Um, and, anyways, this led to some interesting studies where split brain patients were given different inputs through each eye, and each half of their body seemed to function independently. So I'll go through a few examples of this. So a split brain patient can draw or write two different things simultaneously and independently with their left hand and their right hand in a way that normal people simply can't. I mean, so if you're right-handed, maybe it's difficult to write with your left hand, but you can, get it done. It just looks a little like chicken scratch, right? But if you try to write with your right hand and left hand at the same time, that's gonna totally screw you up. You're gonna end up, doing one and then the other. But split brain patients, they actually can do it simultaneously, like independently with both hands, in a way that normal people simply can't because, um, I mean, just try it. Like you just can't do it, but these people can do it as if they're two different people living in one body. Or let's say you have a bunch of different objects in front of a person, and you display instructions to their left eye to pick up one of the objects. Then even though their left hand will follow the instructions and they will pick up the object in question, if you then ask them out loud, um, what they saw, they saw the instructions obviously because they listened to the instructions, but they'll say that they saw nothing because their verbal left brain didn't receive any sensory input. So from the perspective of the part of your brain that actually talks, you didn't see anything and you didn't pick anything up, which is, pretty disturbing if you think about it. A related but separate thing is there's actually this condition called seeing blindness, where a person will be totally convinced that they're blind, and they'll totally not be able to um, they insist that they can't see anything, they can't get around, they can't um, you know they consider themselves blind, and by all evidence they actually believe that. But if you put, three fingers in front of them and ask them how many fingers there are, they'll know that it's three. But to them, it'll feel like they know instinctively. Like they don't understand why they know that it's three, but they kind of have like a premonition. But to their mind, they still really believe that they are blind and they can't see, even though they clearly are receiving visual input that is being converted into thoughts. It's really weird. Um, Anyways, going back to my example, so you told left hand to pick something up, and then you tell left hand to pass the object to the other hand, and then they do, and then the right hand picks up the object, and then now, so right hand is left brain talking left brain, and if you ask them now why they're holding that object, the real reason why they are holding that object is because your left eye got instructions to pass it to your right hand. So that's why it is. But your left brain doesn't know that. So what happens is that your verbal left brain just naturally comes up with a plausible reason, even though the reason has nothing to do with the real reason, since their verbal, like I said, the verbal left brain doesn't know what the real reason is. But is this a lie? What if the function of your verbal capacities is to create a story about your past, to explain your current state to yourself so that you can feel like a coherent whole being despite having no single cell in common with your former self? Kind of like um, the idea of Perseus's ship. If a ship departs from a port and during its journey every single part of it has been replaced, is it still the same ship as it came back as it left as? And in terms of in terms of humans, this ability to generate narratives about yourself and create like this sense of self is what allows us to feel like we are the same being that we remember ourselves to be from um, our childhood. Because if that wasn't the case, then we would not really be able to function well as biological beings, as you can imagine. So maybe you're familiar with how people can actually think that there's a certain reason that they did something or acted in a certain way when actually there was a totally different underlying subconscious reason. And the explicit reason, the reason made of words, is an after the fact justification. So if you think about yourself honestly, you have definitely done this before, where um, you have done something and then you told yourself that there was a certain reason that you did it, but actually there was some deeper underlying emotional reason that you acted that way. And this all fits into a certain Greek idea that the soul was divided between the id and the ego, and that the basically the emotionally driven being, the id, really governs your actions, and the observer being, the ego, observes your emotionally driven actions and tells stories about itself to maintain a sense of self. It also relates to the idea that unprocessed trauma is a failure to properly reconcile these two different parts of yourself with respect to the meaning of some past traumatic event. So the fact that our brain is divided into these two almost like separate half consciousnesses, it actually does have practical implications, um, in terms of psychotherapy and just in terms of analyzing human behavior. Now, all of this does not suggest that you have some other, being living in half of your brain. It just means that your sense of self is an emergent property between two half consciousnesses, which disturbingly can each act as its own separate consciousness under the right circumstances. So, um, it's not that the talking part of your brain is the real you, and then there's this like second, emotional half that's kind of attached like a parasite, or vice versa. Your mind can be thought of as an emergent property between two separate minds, and this emergent property can be broken through problems with the corpus callosum. And maybe you think that it's not you, and there's some other reasons. Maybe you think that you are better than this, and you aren't. You just can't come to terms with the fact that this is how you work, and that there's some other reason why you assign post justifications to your emotionally driven actions, or that you don't even do so. But um, this is exactly the kind of narrative that you would expect your verbal left brain to generate in order to maintain its familiar sense of self. So, in a way, the fact that you think that this seems odd, and it doesn't feel like your brain works like this, that's exactly the kind of thing that your left brain would tell yourself in order to keep um, this sense of self going, because otherwise you go to ego death, and that's no good. You can't really be a properly functioning human in that state. But failure to realize how this works is exactly how people find the arrogance to act in their own corrupt emotional self-interest while convincing themselves incorrectly that they're looking out for the good of others, something that you see in every single left-wing politician without a single exception. And this is because they just simply lack the humility to realize how retarded we are, basically, and how we act emotionally, and the stories that our brain generates about our own motivations for our own actions are often incorrect. And anyways, I could go on forever, but there will have to be multiple broadcasts dedicated to different cognitive biases in the future. But we almost kind of culturally implicitly understand that we work like this, because sometimes you'll do something uncharacteristic, and then the only story that your brain can come up with is, oh, something came over me, right? Because if it almost feels like to your verbal brain that something isn't yourself, but it is yourself. Anyways, I want to talk about this thing called the third wave. So emergence doesn't, absolve us of our responsibility to ensure what emerges from our interactions with each other is good and not evil. So I said that, central planning doesn't work in human societies, but that doesn't mean that everybody should just act, according to their instincts and everything will work out perfectly. Part of what it makes us human is the fact that we can try to assess ourselves, and um, we can take individual actions that don't amount to trying to micromanage others. Through controlling your own self, you can take responsibility for whether the emergent properties of your society are more positive or more negative compared to if you hadn't existed. So the third wave is actually a true story from a real high school class in 1967. And I would encourage everybody to watch this 40-minute video called The Wave, which is a dramatization of the real events that happened in this high school class in 1967. So I'm gonna this it's a real story, and there's a documentary about the story, but I'm gonna talk about the dramatization, because it's pretty close to um, portraying all of the different aspects of what this experiment was. It was basically an experiment, and it starts with a teacher that's teaching their kids about the Holocaust, and one of the students asks, why did nobody try to stop them? Why did none of the Germans stand up against the Nazis? And that is probably a question that we have all asked ourselves at some point. And um, I know that there is this collective sense of um, there's like a complex now in the German people where they kind of feel like the whole Nazi thing is somehow like inherent in their biology, like they have some sort of like genetic tendency to become Nazis. But that is, in my opinion, totally not, doesn't have any footing in the realm of reality. Um, and basically, this teacher tries to set up this experiment to try to show the students how easy it is to fall into totalitarianism. And long story short, the experiment goes a little too well. So um, the teacher starts the next day by teaching them about power and success through discipline. Right? You can make a very convincing and correct argument that um, that power and success requires discipline. So group power and group success would require group discipline. And he starts with minor matters of compliance like uniformity, posture. And there's this one scene in the video where he makes an example out of the class outcast for his good posture. And maybe it's not intentional. Maybe he targets the outcast because he's more susceptible to becoming more compliant. But maybe he can just sense that the outcast is more into the um, new opportunity for social acceptance. Um, Maybe it was just a coincidence. I mean, it's a dramatization anyway. Um, and basically, what this is about is setting the metric for success and linking it to compliance. Now, think about the current social justice environment, and you know that this is happening, right? They're slowly shifting the metrics for success so that they are more in line with being compliant with whatever the current mainstream narrative is. Centrally planned narrative. Then in the story, other behaviors start to come under control, like the way that you are being prepared for class. You have to stand at attention to answer questions by the teacher. And what's interesting about one of these scenes where basically students have to stand at attention next to their desk whenever they answer a question by the teacher. Interesting thing is that even if someone answers the question incorrectly, they're not chastised as severely as answering the question correctly, but in the improper form. So, an incorrect answer in the proper form is held in higher regard than the correct answer in the improper form. Then the teacher tries to foster community, the feeling that you're part of something that is more important than yourself, and the motto becomes strength through discipline, strength through community. And to organize community, he comes up with this meaningful symbol and this name. The third wave. The wave, it represents change, right? And the students quickly become enamored with the positive and powerful emotions of it. And one of the students' mother is worried about the mob psychology aspect and the erosion of individuality. But the student points out that even the students who are slow or slacking off usually are keeping up and being engaged with school for once. Everybody is kind of more emotionally invested in this group mentality, um, and it presents the basically she presented this experiment as a new efficient teaching method, and the father in the story asks why they should be concerned about this new teaching method when other parents seem to not be concerned about it. And it seems to be working with respect to getting all the students to take school seriously, right? And the student later tells her boyfriend about the conversation with her parents, and the boyfriend gets immediately defensive about it. He attributes others' bad behavior to the fact that they are not part of the history class. So, like, I'm talking about like kids skipping school or whatever. Then automatically in his mind, he's thinking, oh, if only they were part of our history class with this strength through discipline, strength through community, then they wouldn't be acting like that, and the world would be a better place, right? And then eventually the class is sent out to recruit new members and assimilate them into their or this new made up order. And then now their motto is strength through discipline, strength through community, strength through action. And you can see in this video how compliance enforces itself through all sorts of natural psychological reactions that create social pressures in favor of compliance and against dissident views. And dissident views are perceived as a threat to the positive things that the project has brought about, which must be protected through the suppression of those dissident views. And this kind of psychological carrot and stick works really well because the carrot feels good and the stick feels bad, and ultimately your actions, you by default are governed by your feelings. You will want to do what feels good, and your brain will create all sorts of post justifications after the fact as to why it's okay to comply, why it's okay to, you know, do whatever it takes to comply, because um, it's almost like you're subconsciously thinking, how can it be wrong if it feels this good, right? So, um, anyways, at some point later on, that class outcast, he remarks for the first time, he tells the teacher that for the first time nobody's making fun of him. He feels special. He feels like he's actually a part of the class, and he almost begins to worship the teacher. And this makes the teacher's lizard brain feel good on some deep level, and the teacher even starts to justify the experiment to himself and to other teachers because he's just trying to make a point, right? This is kind of meta. So like he's trying to he's saying, no, I'm just trying to teach the kids about how people became Nazis. So the fact that they are actually becoming Nazis um, just means that the experiment is working. And that makes sense. You can almost buy that, right? But in this video anyway, and he starts slipping into this role even at home, and it remains ambiguous in the video whether he is actually getting carried away with it or not. And um, the real life version of this teacher actually had the honesty and humility to admit that in that time he actually did end up getting carried away with it, which he realized in retrospect. And so eventually in this video, the teacher announces that this classroom experiment that they were running is actually part of a real national student movement called The Wave to create a better society through strength, discipline, community, action, and pride. And he announces that there's going to be a rally that's going to reveal the national leader of this movement, and everybody is really excited. And now, basically, you had to understand the cultural context at the time. It was during the Vietnam War, so these are high school students, but these high school students have the prospect of being drafted around the corner, right? And there's this that's the kind of the start of the hippie movement. So there's a lot of sentiments about change. So these students actually in the real life version of the story, the students actually believed that there was going to be a third party, not Republican, not Democrat, based on this strength through action, strength through discipline, strength through community um, idea, that they've already seen this play out in their own school in a very fascistic way. Students are beat up for expressing dissident views about the experiment. Students are um, beat up for not wanting to join from other classes, not wanting to join. And a lot of people from other classes and other schools even actually do join. Um, Very interesting because there's one interview in the real life documentary where um, these two kids that got into a fight because one of them didn't want to join. They basically tried to ask what this third wave was about, and the student that was a part of the movement couldn't really answer. What is this movement about, right? It's a history. They almost like everybody's forgotten the fact that this is for an experiment to show how Nazis work, right? So, anyways, this realization that um, they can't really answer, um, it's like an attack. It's like a personal attack on this person, right? Because they've become emotionally invested in this group, so any attack on the group becomes an attack on them. So just the fact that this person is asking, what is the purpose of this group, feels like an attack to him. So he emotionally has to start a fight. Um, Anyways, so the teacher announces that there's going to be a rally and that there's a real um, party being launched, and so on and so forth. So they um, have this rally, and then the teacher reveals that they've fallen for groupthink, just like the Nazis did. He brings it back to the example, and um, I wrote the speech down um, just because I thought it was really good, and it gives you kind of a sense of what this experiment ended up portraying. So he's at this assembly and he says, "All right, this is, we're starting a new party, and here's your national leader on TV." So it goes, quote, "There's your leader," and it shows Hitler on the screen. "Listen carefully. There's no national youth movement. You thought you were so special, better than everyone outside this room. You traded your freedom for the luxury of feeling superior. You accepted the group's will over your own conviction, no matter who you hurt. You thought you were just going for the ride, that you could walk away at any moment. But where were you heading, and how far would you have gone? Take a look at your future. Yes, you would have all made good Nazis. You would have put on the uniform, turned your head, and allowed your friends and neighbors to be persecuted and destroyed. Fascism isn't something that those other people did. It's right here, in all of us. You asked, how could the German people do nothing as millions of human beings were murdered? How could they claim they weren't involved? What causes people to deny their own history? Well, if history repeats itself, you'll all want to deny what has happened to you in the wave. But if our experiment is successful, we'll have learned that we are all responsible for our own actions, and that you must question what you do rather than blindly follow a teacher, and that for the rest of your lives you'll never allow a group's will to usurp your individual rights. I notice it's been painful for you. It certainly has for me, but it's a lesson we'll all share for the rest of our lives." And this event is tremendously traumatizing for all of the students in the dramatization and in real life too, obviously. And it's really hard not to get emotional even watching the dramatization of it, because it just lays bare the dark aspects of human, like, collectivist instinct so nakedly for you to observe. And it's the dramatization is really believable for the time period. Like, you might look at this classroom and think that this is not how students would act now. I mean, fair enough, there are some differences because of the time period difference, but it's the same processes manifesting in different ways with today's cultural Marxism or the social justice movement. Ultimately, it's about how compliance can be confused with virtue if the right perverse incentive structures are in place. And with creeping authoritarianism, it's often the goal to confound compliance with virtue. So, like I said, there's a documentary called Lesson Plan, which is really good. It's actually much better than the dramatization. It's behind a small paywall on YouTube. It's like $4 or something. And it talks about how the teacher had only intended the experiment to last for one day, but when he came back the second day, the students were just still, in it. So he kind of played along with it. So it kind of shows you how this kind of process can perpetuate itself. It's like the students are playing along with the teacher, and then the teacher was playing along with the students, and then everybody was playing along with each other. That's exactly how groupthink works. And the documentary, it also goes into great detail about what different students were thinking about different events, and they really did create this microcosm of totalitarianism. And even though that was the whole point, you can tell that it really created genuine feelings of terror, exclusion, and superiority, even though everybody knew that it was just a fucking experiment. And it's like the Stanford prison experiment, but it's a lot worse and less fake. And so like I said earlier, centralization is not a simple phenomenon. Like I said, layers of systems embedded within each other can form into patterns that involve different degrees of centralization at different levels. So man's constant struggle is to keep that shit in some sort of fucking harmony, which we are quickly losing. It's hard to maintain any sort of harmony in reality when you don't even have a sense of what reality even is. And losing your sense of what reality even is kind of this part of this natural process of centralization, because centralization on a group level is heading more towards groupthink. And Eventually, when this groupthink gets into uh, central planning and self-perpetuating, when the central planning starts to fall apart because central planning doesn't fucking work, then the groupthink will generate all sorts of justifications after the fact, just like individual people do. Um, and that wasn't real socialism, right? And what happens is that you keep having to change what society's accepted reality is so that it still fits in with this narrative that central planning can actually work. And eventually, the groupthink reality becomes so far removed from the actual reality that um, it makes the system work even less, and then the system becomes even more desperate, and the centralization becomes more severe, and it's this like vicious cycle. And if you think about it, that's happening now with this social justice movement today. This like extreme individualism, this extreme equality narrative um, demands that gender doesn't exist. Even if gender does exist, no, it doesn't. This mentality has to generate some sort of narrative to make sure that the reality doesn't get in the way of the narrative that power needs to be more centralized, basically. And what you're seeing a lot of now is an attempt to centralize moral power, moral authority. So basically, trying to get people to comply with the morality narrative of the day. Um, and this is, you can almost think of this as a natural process of filling the moral vacuum left behind with the abandonment of Judeo-Christian values and the adoption of postmodernist moral relativist kind of thinking. And they have to make sure that that's the case, because otherwise people will catch on to the fact that the Western system is better because of certain aspects of liberty and decentralization. And to destroy that in favor of centralization, you basically have to kill all of those real legitimate reasons why centralization just doesn't work when you apply it to a society from like a central planning perspective. And we're wired to basically, for like our emotions, they are rewarded when we are part of the group, and punished if we are not part of the group, because you can think of it as like a biological adaptation, right? That because humans are gregarious, so they congregate into social structures, and that's part of what makes us human. So it makes sense that we have these aspects that make us want to go into this group think. And part of what this falling into this group think does is it kind of calms our psychological need for a sense of purpose. And I usually think of responsibility for your tribe as a necessary purpose. So you want to go into the group think because you want to be a part of your tribe, and you that basically gives you a sense of purpose because your life is a part of something bigger, right? Instead of you just being a nobody and having no real influence on your surroundings. So if we were all in very very isolated tribes, then this could still work, right? We can just go into like a group think of, your tribe of like 30 to 100 people can go into like a complete group think. It's lit. Um, it's like your whole life is just being part of this wonderful like club slash family. And even if your group think is fucked, then all right, the natural selection will just wipe out your tribe, and then there's going to be other tribes that their group think is a little bit more adapted to the environment, so they'll survive. But now, what you've got going on is our ability to fall into this group think and organize ourselves has gotten so good that we can organized into these huge like national group thinks, and when a national group think goes wrong, the costs are just too high. It's not like, oh, this tribe had the wrong group think, so they couldn't survive. So then another tribe comes to fill the space. Now you have massive countries of millions of people, and they fall into a group think. Then nuclear weapons could be involved. So, anyways, going back to responsibility for your tribe as a necessary purpose. So, um, there's actually research that says that anger is the most contagious emotion. All emotions are contagious, but anger is just the most. And it's shown through studies of social media. And if you think about it, anger is the burning desire to have justice for yourself and for your people. And so the fact that anger is wired to be the most like the strongest and most contagious emotion kind of supports this idea that responsibility for your tribe um, is like a necessary emotional part of your being. Now, life comes with suffering, and the moral thing to do from this perspective is to confront that suffering directly and willingly. If you think the world sucks, and I think I can assure you that it's almost certainly probably worse than how much you think it sucks. But your capacity to deal with that negativity is also much greater than you think. And the way to deal with that world suckiness is not to cultivate the envious and destructive spirit of Cain and become resentful at the nature of existence, because that leads you to give up on seeking good and instead to seek to retaliate against God or existence itself, the universe, society. And in this way, being grateful is actually a moral obligation to and a necessary prerequisite to finding your world suckiness reducing purpose. And correspondingly, you have a moral obligation to your creator, to your you don't have to believe in God, but your society created you, right? Your family created you. So you have a moral obligation to your creator to realize your potential in order to take responsibility for your tribe. Otherwise, you're committing the moral crime of not repaying the gratitude of what you have been given by God, existence, being, whatever. You are what's stopping the investments that have been made in you from generating returns by benefiting your environment. So you have a moral obligation to benefit your environment by taking responsibility for your tribe. Otherwise, you worsen your own life and the lives of everyone around you. And instead of being able to confront the malevolence and suffering in this world and actually do something to leave the world a better place than it would have been had you never existed, um, you basically just fall into a vicious psychological, not a vicious, a deep psychological hole. Um, like if you don't repay the gratitude for having been created, I think psychologically you're damned to psychological and spiritual hell. If you fail to live your life according to this idea that you should live as if you are grateful for what you have been given and now you want to give back. It kind of seems like common sense that's maybe been a little bit lost in this day and age, unfortunately. But basically, I think that you should live such that you can tell your dying self on your deathbed that you are worth this planet's time and resources while you are here, and such that you can actually believe the stories that you tell yourself, the stories that formed your sense of identity, were a net benefit to your environment. So there's kind of like two parts here. So you have to, what I think when you die, you have to be able to convince yourself that the stories that you told yourself were true and not delusional. And you have to be able to tell yourself that that story was a net benefit for um, your tribe, whatever your brain tells you that your tribe is. And obviously, that can you can change who you think of as your tribe over time as well. Um, and there was once a time when we really asked ourselves, like the John F. Kennedy quote, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And there's a real reason why we admire those who take responsibility and improve things for their people. And fulfillment is, I think, basically being able to to imply like Fulfillment is basically being able to admire yourself so that implicitly, um, to live with purpose is to identify who you are, who your people are, and take as much responsibility for your people as possible while actually fulfilling the requirements of that responsibility, which requires you to have the humility required to be honest with yourself to truly determine whether you're really on course to provide the maximum benefit to your people. So, in this sense, like ignorance is bliss to some extent, but it doesn't really absolve you because um, I do think that if it, it's the fulfillment is eroded if you haven't done your due diligence enough to have um, reasonable confidence that the stories that you tell yourself are actually true. Because I think subconsciously we actually are aware of this fact to some extent that we tell ourselves stories about ourselves that are not necessarily true. So basically, recap of that would be um, so live so that you can tell yourself that you are worth having in this world, and live so that you can actually believe that. And in order to do that, you have to find out who you are, find out who your people are, um, take some responsibility for your people, and then actually have the self awareness to develop yourself into the kind of person that can realize your potential with respect to providing benefit to those around you. So that's what I had planned for this week. So next week I'll talk about the social trajectory of this postmodern society. I'll talk about the spread of ideological subversion and certain other factors that are contributing to the decline of the West. And um, then, if I have time, I'll talk about how, despite all of these factors that are leading to this inevitable decline of the West, uh, authoritarianism is still the bigger danger out of the choice. If you have if um, if the fall of this civilization is leading to a battle between totalitarianism and anarchy. I'm no anarchist, but I'll take anarchy anytime because authoritarianism is still worse in every way. I mean, just off the top of my head, like China having to double down on zero COVID in order to justify its existence, and now they just have to constantly be locking down and starving people um, because the government can't admit that it was wrong. Because if it can be wrong, then it shouldn't have absolute power, right? So what happens with authoritarianism and central planning is that the government puts itself into a position where it can't be wrong. Because if it can be wrong, then maybe it shouldn't have absolute power, right? And it can't have that. Because, like I said in the first broadcast, systems have to grow because if they don't grow, they just get replaced by systems that do grow. Okay, so that's all for this week. Thanks for listening. Hopefully, you'll tune in again next week, and you know, feel free to send me some comments or questions or future topics. I only have like the first 7 topics planned, so after that, I'll have to be taking suggestions or going back on um, topics that I have already mentioned and going into them in more detail, or maybe just discussing current events. I do plan on eventually um, including like a current events update in these broadcasts. I just wanted to take the first 5 or 6 to kind of lay out my thesis in like a very um, improvised way to kind of basically just trying to um, explain it to myself, really, to try to listen to myself and see where I can improve these explanations in the future. And your feedback would really help with that purpose. So I won't go on anymore. Thanks for tuning in, and hopefully you'll tune in again next week. Bye.